She was pregnant with his heir, living in a palace of glass and gold. But while Eleanor's medical bills went unpaid, her billionaire husband was spending millions on his mistress, even insuring her hands like priceless art. This is a story of betrayal, greed, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to break. If her journey moves you, please leave one like and one share to support the channel. Thanks for watching.
He had the world at his feet, a billionaire empire, a wife expecting his first heir, and a secret that threatened to burn it all down. Eleanor believed her life was a fairy tale, but her prince was squandering a massive fortune. He was not investing in their family or their future, but fueling a secret life with a mistress that involved more than just diamonds or silk. He insured his mistress' hands for millions, while his own pregnant wife struggled to pay basic medical bills. This story goes far beyond simple infidelity. It is a twisted, gritty saga of greed, calculated lies, and a final reveal that will absolutely floor you. Keep listening closely. Eleanor Vance lived what looked like a perfect life. Her husband, Julian, was a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with tech innovation and old money status. Their Park Avenue penthouse stood as a monument to his ego, featuring sweeping, cinematic views of Central Park that Eleanor often stared at while lost in her own thoughts. At 32 years old and pregnant with their first son, she should have been completely thrilled. She was dedicated to the baby. Julian, however, had slowly transformed into a distant, cold stranger living within the carefully arranged confines of her world. Their early romance felt like a whirlwind. Julian, charismatic and stunningly handsome, had swept the talented art curator off her feet effortlessly. He claimed to love her sharp eye and quiet wit, plus the fact that she never fawned over his status or bank account. 5 years into the marriage, that spark had long since vanished, replaced by empty, silent dinners, endless charity galas, and the cold, unfeeling drone of his business empire. The pregnancy briefly reignited his interest in her. He was suddenly tender, his warm hand resting on her belly with a pride that thrilled Eleanor, yet it somehow still unsettled her. But as the months dragged on, his business trips multiplied, and his excuses for working late hours grew more elaborate, shifting from believable to clearly fabricated stories that left Eleanor feeling increasingly isolated. The first crack in her golden cage was small, almost invisible. The office of Dr. Ramirez, a top-tier New York clinic, called the house. A polite, deeply apologetic voice informed Eleanor that her last 2 prenatal bills were long overdue. Overdue, Eleanor laughed, a light, tinkling sound that stayed trapped in her throat and did not reach her eyes. "Surely this is just some massive mistake," she replied. "My husband's office manages every single detail. I am certain it is just an oversight on their end." "Of course, Mrs. Vance," the receptionist replied, though a distinct note of doubt colored her professional voice. "Maybe just send a reminder to his people." Eleanor felt a hot, uncomfortable flush creep up her neck. It was truly mortifying to be told this. The Vances, late on a simple medical bill, it was absolutely ridiculous. That evening, she mentioned it, as Julian loosened his expensive silk tie, his shoulders slumped with a heavy, performative exhaustion that felt much deeper than just work. "Prenatal bills. Darling, do not worry your pretty head about such trivial things," he said, waving a hand dismissively as he walked past her. "I will have Marcus fix it in the morning. Probably some new intern messing up the accounting files," he muttered. Marcus Thorne was Julian's weary, hyper-efficient chief financial officer, a man who rarely ever slipped up. Eleanor wanted to ask why she was being contacted directly instead of his department handling it, but she bit her tongue and stayed quiet. Julian had already moved on, scrolling endlessly through his phone. The cold blue light illuminated his face, making him look like a total stranger to her. A week later, another call came in. This time, the tone was firmer and less patient. "Mrs. Vance, we still have not received payment. We value you as a patient, but we need to settle this account before your next scheduled visit." The shame was a cold, heavy knot in Eleanor's stomach, making alternative payment arrangements for the wife of Julian Vance. It was unthinkable. She paid the balance immediately with her personal credit card, the one Julian topped up monthly for her allowance. It was a term she had always hated, but one she had finally learned to accept as the price of her lifestyle. The cost was not huge, but the principle of the situation really stung. Why had Julian or Marcus failed to handle it? She told herself it was just high-stakes stress. Julian was building a new headquarters in Berlin. After all, he was under massive pressure, but a seed of deep doubt had been planted, slowly growing in the dry, lonely soil of her isolated marriage. Her best friend, Chloe, a sharp and successful lawyer, listened as they sat over lattes. It is weird. Julian is not broke by any means, and Marcus Thorne, that man is a bloodhound for numbers. He would not miss this twice. So, what exactly are you saying? Eleanor asked, nervously tracing the rim of her cup. It is either deliberate, which is incredibly cruel, or something is distracting Julian so much that his systems are failing. Neither option is good, Chloe said. Chloe's gaze was steady and unwavering. Is he still acting distant toward you? Eleanor nodded, a tight, painful lump forming in her throat. Very distant. He was in Milan last week for a major tech conference. But when I called the hotel to reach him, they had no record of him or his company being there. Chloe raised an eyebrow. Did you ask him about it? He claimed it was a last-minute change to a colleague's home. His excuses are smooth, but they feel hollow, Eleanor whispered. Eleanor sighed deeply. I hate feeling like this. Chloe, like some sort of amateur detective in my own home. Sometimes, darling, Chloe said, squeezing her hand. You have to be. The next incident was much worse. Eleanor went in for a routine scan. The pure joy of seeing her baby on the screen was ruined when the desk clerk asked her to settle the bill before leaving. This time, her personal card was declined. Heat rushed to her face and she felt suddenly faint. The clerk, Martha, looked at her with genuine pity. It happens, dear. Try another card if you have one. Eleanor fumbled in her Hermes bag, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her wallet. She knew her other cards, all linked to Julian's account, would fail, too. She had some cash, but nowhere near enough for the massive fee. I left my primary card at home, she stammered, the lie tasting like bitter ash in her mouth. Can you just bill me later? Martha's polite smile tightened into a grim line. Normally, yes, but given your outstanding balance, I cannot. Eleanor felt the floor drop away from her, heavily pregnant in a top-tier hospital, unable to pay for her own baby's care. The irony was incredibly bitter. Julian could buy a company on a whim, but he would not cover his own wife's medical bills. She called Chloe, who transferred the necessary funds instantly to cover the cost. The hush of the hospital staff, the pitying looks, it was a new level of public torment. That night, Eleanor did not wait for an apology. She marched straight into Julian's office, a sleek cold space dominated by a giant, imposing mahogany desk. He was on the phone, speaking fluent German, a language he frequently used to shut her out of his life. She stood there, arms tightly crossed, until he finally looked up, his eyes narrowing in clear annoyance. He held up a finger, signaling her to wait. Eleanor did not budge an inch. When he finally hung up, his voice was like ice. Eleanor, I am in a crucial negotiation right now. So was I, Julian, she said, her voice trembling with held-back rage. Negotiating how to pay for our child's scan because my card was declined at the hospital. Do you have any idea how that felt? He looked briefly, visibly uncomfortable. Declined. That is impossible. I transferred a massive sum into the household accounts just this morning. He frowned, tapping aggressively on his keyboard. Marcus confirmed the transfer. There must be a glitch. It is not the first time. Julian, the doctor's office has been chasing me for weeks now. I paid them myself eventually. What is actually going on here? Julian stood, walking toward her, trying his usual move, soothing words and physical distance. Darling, please calm down. It is not good for you or the baby to get worked up. He tried to hug her, but she stepped back sharply. Do not you dare tell me to calm down. This is not a glitch. This is pure neglect. Are we broke? He let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Financial problems. Eleanor, we are worth more than some small countries. Be serious. Then what is it? She stared deeply into his eyes, hunting for the truth he was hiding. Because it looks like you just do not care enough to handle these basic things. His face hardened. That is completely unfair. My life is dedicated to providing for this family. These are minor, technical errors, and I am sorry you were embarrassed. It will not happen again, I promise. I will call Marcus and have him triple-check every single transaction. He made a show of grabbing his phone, but Eleanor was not buying it. The way he dismissed her, calling his own failures minor errors, was more infuriating than the bills themselves. She left his office, the silence between them thick and cold. That night, lying in their massive bed with Julian's side cold and empty, Eleanor reached a breaking point. He claimed he was working late, but she knew better. If he would not give her the truth, she would take it for herself. Her target, Marcus Thorne. No more going through Julian, she was going to the source. The next morning she dialed Marcus's private line. "Marcus, this is Eleanor Vance. We need to talk, right now, in private." There was a sharp, uncomfortable pause on the other end. "Mrs. Vance, is everything okay?" "No, Marcus, it is not. And I have a strong feeling you know exactly why." They met at a quiet, hidden cafe in the West Village, miles away from the prying eyes of the Vance Industries skyscraper. Marcus was in his late 50s, always sharp, but today his kind eyes were clouded with real, palpable fear. He had been Julian's loyal right hand for many years, yet Eleanor had always seen a decent man buried under that corporate machine. "Eleanor," he started, stirring his drink nervously, "I want you to know the medical bill issues were fixed the moment Julian mentioned them to me. A new clerk in the accounts department messed up the coding for personal expenses. It was a simple, honest mistake, and I apologize sincerely." Eleanor stared him down. His excuse was far too polished. It sounded exactly like something Julian would say. "Marcus, I appreciate the coffee and the apology, but that is not the whole story." Marcus avoided her direct gaze, focusing intently on his cup. "I am not sure what you mean by that. My card was declined." "Marcus, for a significant ultrasound bill, not just a small copay. Julian claimed he moved a massive sum into our accounts yesterday. Was that actually true?" He hesitated. "Yes, a standard monthly transfer happened," he said. "Standard." Eleanor pushed harder. "Enough for bills and my allowance." "Sure, but not if something else was draining the cash." Marcus turned pale. He looked up, his expression haunted. "Eleanor, my job, my loyalty to Julian." "Your loyalty is exactly why I am here," she interrupted. "You know his patterns better than anyone. Has there been anything weird? Any large, hidden payments?" He let out a long, shaky, defeated sigh. "Julian's spending is absolutely massive. He keeps a private fund, handled only by him, for his most personal matters." "Has that fund seen more activity lately?" Marcus rubbed his thinning hair nervously. "Hypothetically," he said, choosing every word with extreme care. "If that fund saw a massive outflow for high-value personal assets, he might tighten the other accounts to keep his liquidity levels exactly where he likes them. Julian hates seeing his primary accounts drop below a certain mark," he explained. Eleanor felt a chill wash over her. "High-value assets like what?" "Marcus, art jewelry." He looked truly pained. "It is not my place to say. He is my husband, after all." Elena snapped, her voice sharpening as the reality of her situation cut through the air. "I am carrying his child," she stated, her posture rigid with a mix of fury and protective instinct. "His need for privacy is actively hurting my medical care, and that is a line that should never have been crossed. My baby comes first, always. I am not asking you to torch your career or destroy your own professional standing, Marcus. But if there is something happening that directly affects the safety and well-being of my family, I have a right to know the truth." Marcus checked the perimeter of the cafe, his eyes darting toward the entrance before he leaned in, lowering his voice to a hurried whisper. "Large payments go out of his accounts regularly to an entity, a consultant for what are labeled as specialized services," he revealed. "The numbers are astronomical, frankly. Large enough to make anyone with half a brain stop and stare in disbelief. I started digging into the ledger, but I could not make sense of it. What kind of consultant, exactly? The invoices are always coded so vaguely that they practically defy any logical interpretation. Things like artistic consultation or high-level performance expertise," Marcus muttered, tracing a pattern on the tabletop with his finger. "And the beneficiary," Marcus hesitated, looking visibly uncomfortable with what he was about to reveal. "It is routed through a shell company called Argent Services. But, according to the private, internal memos that Julian keeps locked away, The money is actually intended for a woman named Serafina Dubois. I cannot find a single business reason for this, he admitted, shrugging his shoulders as if to distance himself from the toxic information he had just shared. The name meant nothing to her. A completely blank space in the narrative of her life. Serafina Dubois, she repeated, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Have you ever actually met her in person? Never, Marcus replied, shaking his head. She is like a ghost. Everything associated with her is encrypted and buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. Elenina felt her heart racing, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Artistic consultation. It sounded like a total cover story designed to hide something far more personal and devastating than a simple business deal gone wrong. Marcus, anything else? Any big, one-off payments that stood out from the regular schedule? She pressed him, desperate for the full picture. He wrestled with himself for a long moment, staring into his cooling coffee, before finally whispering. Months ago, there was a massive transfer from his private fund, sent directly to an overseas account. The memo line was incredibly strange. It just said, Premium SD Asset Protection. It felt like something out of a spy novel, something that had no place in the life she thought they had built together in their quiet, comfortable world. It went through a broker specializing in high-risk policies, similar to those managed at Lloyd's of London, he explained quietly. Elenina knew the name well. They insured million-dollar jewels, historic artifacts, and the most famous voices in the world. Asset protection, she whispered, the words echoing in her mind. It seemed so clinical, yet the implication behind it was anything but. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the realization began to dawn on her that this was not just a business expense, but something intensely personal and deeply hidden. SD for Serafina Dubois, she realized, the connection snapping into place with agonizing clarity. Marcus just looked at her, his face pained, his eyes conveying a silent apology for being the bearer of such harsh news. He had said enough. Eleanor left the cafe, her mind spinning as if the very ground beneath her was shifting. Serafina, Argent Services, an insurance policy from Lloyd's. It was all so confusing, a jagged puzzle, but it was starting to paint a dark, twisted picture of the man she had called her husband for all these years. Julian was not just neglectful or distant, he was actively funneling fortune-sized amounts of money away from their family. And this Serafina was the absolute center of it all. Back in her cold, opulent apartment, a new hard resolve began to set in. The hurt was still there, a throbbing wound in her chest, but it was slowly being replaced by an ice-cold anger that felt almost empowering. She realized she was not just being ignored in her time of need. She was being systematically cheated by the person who had vowed to protect her. Her first move was a deep, systematic search for Serafina Dubois, scouring every corner of the internet for a lead. The results were remarkably thin for someone who was pulling in millions of dollars in payments. She found a few photos from charity galas in places like Monaco or St. Moritz, where Serafina was always photographed on the arm of some wealthy, older man, playing the role of the elegant companion perfectly. It was a life of glamour that contrasted sharply with the domestic deception Julian had been weaving behind her back. She was stunning in an exotic, ethereal way, with dark hair and striking, pale eyes that seemed to look right through the camera lens. In the few clear shots she found, her hands stood out more than anything else. Long, elegant, perfectly manicured, and unmistakably artistic. Eleanor searched again, narrowing her parameters. What kind of career required such specific maintenance and insurance? She had to find the link. The reason why Julian would be so obsessed with protecting these specific physical attributes of a woman he kept so carefully hidden from his real life. Serafina Dubois, pianist. Finally, the search engine returned some hits. She clicked through a few articles in obscure music journals, reading quickly. Serafina was a concert pianist not world-famous by stadium standards, but highly respected in the most elite, sophisticated circles of Europe. She was a professional of the highest caliber, known for her technical precision and her ability to bring complex, forgotten pieces to life. It was a respectable profession, yet it made the secret payments and the massive insurance policy feel even more suspicious. praised for her incredible touch and her supernatural dexterity at the keys. Her hands, Elelenina whispered, her throat tightening with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Premium SD asset protection. Could it be? Had Julian actually insured this woman's hands for millions of dollars while their own financial future was being squeezed? It sounded completely insane, like something from a deranged fiction. But everything was starting to fit together with a chilling, logical precision that she could no longer deny. She felt the walls of her life closing in around her. Julian was a cold, pragmatic shark who calculated every move he made with mathematical accuracy. Why would he bother to insure a pianist's hands unless she was significantly more valuable to him than Elelenina could ever guess? She knew she needed cold, hard proof to confront him, or he would simply spin a lie that would make her feel like she was losing her mind. Remembering what Chloe had said about her network of associates, she knew exactly who to call. Chloe had contacts everywhere, and she was the only one who could help. "Chloe," Elelenina said, her voice strained and barely above a whisper. "I need that investigator you mentioned a while back, the one who is good and very, very discreet. What is going on?" "Eleanor," Chloe asked, her tone instantly sharp and protective. "I think Julian is having an affair, but it is actually worse than that," she explained. "It is complicated, and I think he is paying for millions of dollars in insurance on her." There was a pause, a heavy silence that hung between them as the weight of the accusation landed. Silence on the other end of the line. "Insuring what, Elelenina?" Chloe finally asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Her hands," Eleanor said, the absurdity of it hitting her like a crashing wave. "He is insuring his mistress's hands while my prenatal bills are going unpaid and my own medical needs are being neglected." Another long silence followed, and then Chloe's voice turned grim and decisive. "I will make the call right now," she vowed. "You will hear from him within an hour. His name is Michael Rock. Trust him with everything. You will hear from him within an hour. His name is Michael Rock. Trust him completely." Michael Rock was exactly as promised when he arrived at her door, a former detective with a quiet, razor-sharp edge and an uncanny ability to read a room. He listened to her story without interrupting once, his face entirely unreadable. When she finally mentioned the name of Lloyd's of London and the policy structure, he nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the high-stakes game that Julian was playing behind the scenes. "Those policies are ironclad," he said with a grimace. "But everyone leaves a digital trail if you know where to look. People always get sloppy when they think they are untouchable." Eleanor gave him everything she had managed to gather. Serafina's name, the shell company information, the dates of the suspicious bank transfers, and Julian's travel logs. He took the folder, his movements precise and professional, and promised to get back to her with hard, undeniable proof. She felt a small measure of relief, though her nerves remained frayed. Rock promised to reach out with hard proof as soon as he had it. The wait was pure torture, a slow crawl of endless agonizing hours. Elelenina went through her days on autopilot yoga, lunch with her mother, small talk acting normal while a hurricane of rage and sorrow raged inside her. Julian was home more now, acting attentive and playing the role of the doting husband. But every smile he gave her felt like a lie, and every touch he offered felt like a betrayal of the vows he had broken long before she became pregnant. He even brought her flowers, a massive, beautiful bouquet of her favorite peonies with a note apologizing for the billing nightmare she had been dealing with. It felt like a sick, twisted joke, knowing what he was funding in Paris. A week later, Rock called her. "Mrs. Vance, I found something. It is confirmed. A policy was taken out 6 months ago, underwritten by a syndicate at Lloyd's." He delivered the news with the clinical precision of a man who dealt in the wreckage of other people. Lives every single day of the week. The insured is Serafina Dubois. The asset, policy value, $5 million. Eleanor slumped into a chair, the phone trembling in her hand as the world tilted. $5 million. "The premiums are massive," Rock added, his voice low. "Routed from a private Geneva account controlled by Julian. That same account funds Argent LLC, which pays for a lavish Paris apartment where she lives." The numbers were staggering, far beyond what she had imagined. and they revealed exactly where his heart and his money truly resided. Paris, of course. Where else would a concert pianist with insured hands live but in the heart of the City of Light? There is more, Rock said, his voice soft and hesitant. Ms. Dubois is not just a pianist to him. She is Julian Vance's long-term mistress. They have been together for at least 3 years, he confirmed, long before you were pregnant, and maybe even before you were married. The timeline shattered what little hope she had left that this was a recent mistake. It was a lifetime of deception. The news hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath right out of her lungs. 3 years, not a recent slip-up or a moment of weakness. It was a parallel life, a total, orchestrated deception running alongside their marriage. Her love, her trust, her entire future, all of it had been built on a foundation of professional-grade lies. And the cruelest cut of all was knowing he had been playing this part for so long, looking her in the eyes every night while keeping his true priorities elsewhere. He valued this woman's hands, these instruments of art, more than the health of his own wife and their unborn child. The symbolism was as devastating as the truth itself. The phone clattered from her fingers, landing on the floor with a hollow thud. The apartment, which had once been a symbol of her gilded life and social status, now felt like a gilded cage where she was merely a guest in her own home. She sat in the dark, the weight of the reality pressing down on her shoulders. Silence filled the room, broken only by her frantic heartbeat and the faint, innocent flutter of the baby inside her, a child whose father had made his true priorities sickeningly clear. Rage hit her first, a white-hot inferno that threatened to consume her. Eleanor paced their living room as the New York City skyline turned into a mocking, glittering backdrop for her crumbling world. She felt like a stranger in her own life, surrounded by objects that no longer held any meaning because they were purchased with the currency of deceit. 3 years. He looked her in the eyes and vowed his love, all while another woman held a significant, insured place in his life. The sheer, calculated audacity of it was breathtaking. Then came the pain, a deep, aching sorrow that settled in her bones, making her feel heavy and ancient, as if she had lived 100 years in the space of a few minutes. She realized that she had been living a performance, a play where she was the only one who did not know the script. How could she have been so blind? Were there signs she ignored just to protect the fairy tale she desperately wanted to believe in? Julian's frequent trips to Paris, his sudden, convenient French fluency, the expensive lingerie she found in his luggage that he dismissed as a gift for a client's wife. She had rationalized it all, explaining away every red flag to keep the peace. Now those excuses felt like small, pathetic lies she had told herself to avoid facing the dark reality that had been staring her in the face. Each memory felt like a fresh stab of betrayal, sharper than the last. But beneath the rage, a core of steel was forming. She was pregnant. Her child deserved better than a father capable of such duplicity, and a mother paralyzed by grief. Eleanor Vance had been naive, perhaps, but she was not weak. She began to focus on what came next, letting the pain harden into purpose. She would not be a victim in her own life anymore. She would be the architect of her own escape and justice. She needed a plan. Something that would dismantle him the way he had dismantled her. Michael Rock provided a detailed report that was a masterpiece of investigative work. Bank statements, surveillance photos of Julian and Serafina looking intimate in the streets of Paris, and a summary of that massive Lloyd's policy. It was all there, recorded in black and white, leaving no room for excuses or gaslighting. She had the ammunition she needed to bring the entire facade crashing down around his ears. The premiums alone cost more than their yearly budget for household expenses, a fact that made her blood boil. Eleanor decided the final confrontation would happen at their upstate New York estate, far from the city lights. Julian loved his city sanctuary, but this house was remote, private and, she thought grimly, the perfect place to dismantle the facade of their perfect life. She would make him look at the mess he had created, and she would make sure he knew there was no going back after this night. She waited for a weekend he had cleared for quality time before the baby arrived, a time he likely intended to use for more lies. She ordered his favorite dinner and the finest wine, setting the table with meticulous care. She dressed carefully, not in maternity wear, but in an elegant silk dress from before the pregnancy. It was a reminder of the woman he once courted, a symbol of the person she had been before he had molded her into a puppet of his design. Julian arrived Friday, all smiles and fake concern, playing the part of the devoted husband to perfection. "Darling, you look beautiful. It is so good to be here. Just us," he said, his voice oozing with practiced charm. He kissed her a dry, perfunctory peck that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn. Dinner was tense, though he did not seem to notice. Eleanor played the serene wife, listening while Julian prattled on about artificial intelligence breakthroughs, his voice booming with the kind of arrogance that only the truly guilty possess. She really watched him for the first time in many years. His handsome face now looked marred by the deceit that lived behind his eyes, his confident gestures reeking of an ego that was finally going to meet its match. After the main course, as the staff cleared the plates and the mood grew quiet, Eleanor placed a slim, professional-looking leather folder on the polished table between them. It was a small, unassuming object, but she knew it held the power to destroy everything he valued. "Julian," she said, her voice eerily calm and devoid of the affection he expected, "we need to discuss something important." He looked surprised, then irritated at the interruption of his monologue. "Can it wait, Eleanor?" "I was getting to the exciting part about the new neural networks," he complained, his brow furrowing. "No," she said firmly, her gaze locking onto his. "It cannot wait." She pushed the folder his way, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Perhaps you should look at this," she suggested, watching his face closely. He frowned, sighing as he picked up the folder with a look of annoyance. "More bills. I thought we settled that," he muttered. He opened it, expecting a list of expenses. Eleanor watched his eyes scan the first page, and she saw the moment his soul left his eyes. A photo of him and Serafina arm in arm in Paris. His smile froze instantly, turning into a rigid mask of terror. His face, just moments ago flushed with wine and the thrill of his own self-importance, drained of all color until he looked like a ghost. He flipped to the next page, then the next, his hands shaking. The bank statements, the Lloyd's policy. The silence in the dining room became absolute, save for the rhythmic, mocking ticking of an antique grandfather clock. He was breathing heavily, his entire world collapsing in real time as he stared at the evidence of his double life. Julian's knuckles turned white as he gripped the papers until they crinkled. He did not speak for a long time, staring at the evidence as if he could will it to vanish. Finally, he looked up, eyes narrowed, shifting from shock to a cold, controlled anger that he hoped would intimidate her. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Does it matter where I got it?" "Julian," Eleanor replied, her calm unwavering and her resolve stronger than his rage. "Is it true?" He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This is an outrageous invasion of my privacy," he shouted, trying to regain his footing. "Have you been spying on me like some cheap detective?" "Your privacy." Eleanor let out a bitter, humorless laugh that cut through his defensiveness. "You talk about privacy while living a double life for 3 years, funding a mistress in Paris with my security and my future. You have absolutely no right to speak to me about privacy. Do not act so melodramatic, Eleanor. Serafina is simply a friend, a very talented artist that I happen to support." Eleanor shot back instantly, her voice rising with a sharp edge of disbelief. "A friend? A friend whose hands you chose to insure for $5 million. A friend for whom you pay exorbitant luxury apartment fees, while your own pregnant wife deals with unpaid medical bills. You are living in a fantasy, Julian, and I am finished listening to these pathetic lies. What kind of friend is that, Julian? And what does that make you, as a husband?" He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards as he moved. "You simply do not understand the pressures I am under every single day." Eleanor stood to meet him, her hand instinctively protective over her belly. "I understand perfectly now," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "You are a liar, and I have finally seen exactly who you are behind all those empty promises. I understand your priorities are deeply twisted if you value a pianist's hands more than your own flesh and blood." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Those prenatal bills. Julian, was it a simple oversight? Or were you diverting our funds to Serafina so aggressively that you could not even cover the basic costs of our child's care? He ran a hand through his hair, his composure finally starting to crack under the pressure of her gaze. It was just a temporary cash flow issue, a minor accounting error. That is all. Serafina's personal situation is quite complex, and she needed my support, needed support. Eleanor's voice dripped with bitter sarcasm, to the tune of millions of dollars, while I was sitting in the doctor's office, humiliated and unable to pay for a simple ultrasound. Do you have any idea what that felt like for me? He looked away, unable to meet her eyes as the truth hung heavy. I already apologized for that. It was a mistake. No, Julian, Eleanor whispered, her voice sounding like cold steel. It was a calculated choice. You chose her over us. She picked up her wine glass, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her hand. Why this elaborate, pathetic deception? Why Serafina of all people? Julian stared at her, his expression a chaotic mix of raw anger, deep guilt, and a frantic, quiet desperation. Perhaps there was a hint of pure panic in his eyes. Serafina understands me, he argued. She appreciates the sacrifices I make for my work. She does not make unreasonable demands like you. The insult hit her like a physical slap to the face. Unlike your pregnant wife who expects her bills to be paid, and a faithful husband, those are big demands, are they not? It is not like that, he pleaded, his anger finally fading. I love you. You have to believe that. This entire thing with Serafina, it simply got out of hand. Out of hand, Eleanor echoed, her voice trembling with rage. Insuring her hands for $5 million with Lloyd's is not an accident. That is meticulous, cold-blooded planning. That is a clear statement of value. He sank into his chair, looking utterly defeated and small. What exactly do you want? Eleanor, I want the truth, she replied, staring him down with newfound strength. I want all of it, no more lies, and no more childish games. Her voice turned icy cold, stripping away any remaining warmth. I want a divorce. The word hung there in the silence, heavy and final. Julian looked completely stunned, as if the thought had never crossed his mind. A divorce, Eleanor, do not be so rash. We can fix this mess if you just calm down. Think about the baby, please. I am thinking about the baby, she said, her hand resting firmly on her stomach. He deserves a home built on truth, not a foundation of constant lies. He deserves a mother who is not a fool, and, quite honestly, he deserves a much better father than you could ever be. Julian stared at her, his face going pale as the reality of her resolve set in. The power dynamic in the room had shifted for good. Eleanor, now armed with the truth, was not the blind, naive wife she had been just an hour ago. She was a woman deeply betrayed, but she had finally found her backbone. There is more to this, isn't there? She pressed him, a sudden realization striking her. This is not just some cheap, cliched affair. This feels much bigger, much darker. That insurance policy, it is far too excessive, even for a man as arrogant as you are. Why, Julian? What are you really hiding about Serafina Dubois? He looked toward the dark windows, watching their strained, blurry reflections. She had leverage, he muttered. Leverage. Eleanor's blood went cold as she leaned in. What kind of leverage? Julian finally met her eyes, and she saw genuine, gut-wrenching fear behind his stare. She knows things, Eleanor. Secrets about my business that could ruin me. Secrets that could destroy everything I have built over all these years. The room seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. This was no longer about a common cheating husband. This was dangerous, serious business. His mistress was not just a lover, she was a lethal threat. And Julian, the powerful titan, was trapped deep in her web. By extension, Eleanor realized so was she. The realization that Serafina Dubois held leverage over Julian hit Eleanor like a physical blow. It changed the entire landscape of their marriage. This was not just a painful, embarrassing affair, it was a sinister game. That $5 million insurance policy on her hands did not look like a gift anymore. It was a bribe, a shield against a looming, dark threat that Julian was too cowardly to confront. What kind of secrets? Eleanor demanded, her voice low and sharp. What does she know? Julian began to pace, his usual ego replaced by a hunted, desperate look. It goes back many years, long before I even met you. When I was starting Vance Industries in Europe, I cut corners. I worked with people I definitely should not have dealt with, and Serafina was there in the thick of it. Not directly, but she was deeply connected to a very dangerous man in Monaco, someone who bankrolled my early expansion when real banks would not give me the time of day. Serafina was his protégé, his right hand. She saw everything I did. Eleanor felt a cold knot of dread tighten in the pit of her gut. And this man, what happened to him? He died a few years ago. Conveniently, some might say. Julian looked at her, his eyes hollow and haunted. Serafina inherited much more than his art collection. She inherited his secrets, including mine. So, your relationship, it was never really an affair. Was it? It was a continuous, forced payment plan, keeping her happy, keeping her quiet. Julian nodded slowly. At first, there was genuine attraction. She is sharp, intelligent, and exciting. But after her patron died, the dynamic changed completely. She became demanding and cold. The Paris apartment, the high allowance, the consulting fees, it was all just hush money for her silence. She called it her due for her silence, and the insurance on her hands. Eleanor pressed, needing to understand the full scope. Why those? He let out a bitter, joyless laugh. That was her masterpiece. Her hands are her life. She claimed that knowing me put her at risk from my old, dangerous associates. She said that if anything ever happened to her ability to play the piano, she would release her memoirs. Memoirs that would detail every dirty deal and every single name involved. He stopped and stood in front of Eleanor. The policy was never for her hands. Really, it was to protect me from her wrath. Golden handcuffs, that is what they were, if she is well paid and her assets are covered by me. She has a stake in my continued success. Eleanor sank into her chair, feeling the weight of it all. Her husband was not just a cheater. He was compromised, tangled in a criminal mess, and effectively owned by his own mistress. The unpaid nursery bills now felt like a cruel, small footnote in a much larger, darker story. He had not forgotten them at all. He had been far too busy paying off a woman who held his empire in her manicured hands. So all this time, Eleanor said, while we were busy planning the nursery, you were managing a ticking time bomb. I wanted to protect you, Julian whispered. I thought I could handle her, keep it separate from our lives. Separate. Eleanor's voice rose in anger. It is our entire life. Her shadow has been over us for years, draining our future, poisoning our home. Why not just come clean to the authorities? He looked at her like she was completely insane. And lose everything I have worked for. My company, my reputation. Be real, Eleanor. That was never an option on the table. So your master plan was to betray your wife, neglect your child, and stay under this woman's thumb forever. The argument raged on for hours. Julian, finally stripped of his power, tried pleading, then rationalizing, then even hinting at the ruinous cost of a public scandal. But Eleanor stayed firm. The trust was gone and could not be recovered. By dawn, they reached a fragile, exhausted truce. Julian agreed to the divorce. He also agreed to full transparency about Serafina, but only with Eleanor and her lawyer, Chloe, whom she insisted join them immediately. Chloe arrived by midday, looking grim but ready as Eleanor explained the chaos of the night. Marcus Thorne arrived shortly after, looking pale and anxious, clearly relieved that the exhausting charade was finally ending. The next few days were a blur of tense, exhausting meetings in the library. Chloe, a shark in the courtroom, took complete charge, grilling Julian and a nervous Marcus about the full extent of Serafina's reach. It became painfully clear that Serafina was not just a victim. She was an active, ruthless player, constantly manipulating Julian and holding those secrets over his head for years. The invoices for artistic consulting were a complete sham, just a way of funneling cash to her. The insurance policy is the key, Chloe concluded after many hours. It is not about her hands. It is a symbol of power. She insisted on Lloyd's of London for the prestige and the signal that Julian values her assets above all else. She even hand-picked the specific syndicate, Marcus added quietly, one known for deep investigation and international reach. It was a massive power move. In a rare private moment, Chloe turned to Eleanor. What about Serafina, beyond the divorce? I mean, Julian is absolutely terrified of her. He will likely keep paying her forever if we do not act. Eleanor thought about it for a long time. Part of her wanted to destroy Serafina completely, but a more practical part, thinking of her unborn child, knew that a war with such a woman could be dangerous and damaging to her future. I want her neutralized, Eleanor said firmly. No hold over Julian that could ever hurt my child's future, if he is to pay support. I need to know it isn't going to Paris under blackmail. Chloe nodded in agreement. Smart thinking. Direct confrontation is always risky, but we can use what we know to our advantage. The plan they built was bold. Julian, under Chloe's strict direction, would call Serafina. He would not cut her off instantly, that was far too dangerous. Instead, he would propose a final lump sum settlement, a golden handshake in exchange for a binding deal. She signs an agreement and hands over all records of his past. The threat that Julian, pushed to the absolute edge by the divorce, was ready to confess everything himself, a controlled demolition of his own empire to destroy her leverage. He would claim he was coming clean to save his relationship with his child, playing the role of the repentant father. It was a high-stakes, dangerous bluff. If Serafina called it, Julian could lose everything. But Chloe suspected Serafina was much more greedy than vengeful. Her goal was a life of permanent luxury, not Julian's total ruin, which would kill her golden goose forever. Julian, desperate and seeing no other way out, finally agreed to the plan. The call was made from the library, with Eleanor and Chloe listening on speakerphone, acting as a silent, unseen jury. "Serafina, darling," Julian began, trying to summon his old charm, though his voice was clearly strained. "Julian," she purred back, her accent as smooth and sharp as a blade, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Trouble with the missus again." Eleanor flinched at the sound of her voice. "Something like that." Julian took a deep breath. "Things have escalated. Eleanor knows about us. She has filed for divorce. Oh, how truly unfortunate. For her and your growing family, of course. What does this mean for us?" Her tone was icy, cold, and purely business. "It means change," Julian said, while Chloe fed him lines from across the room. "I am offering a final settlement, a very generous one, mind you, in exchange for your total silence and every single souvenir you kept from your former benefactor, of course." Serafina let out a laugh, a low, chilling sound that made Elena shudder where she stood. "A final settlement. You truly think that is how this ends? Julian, darling, our arrangement is for life. Have you completely forgotten the terms?" "I haven't forgotten a single thing," Julian snapped back, his voice hardening. "But listen to me. If this divorce turns ugly, and let us be honest, it will if you do not cooperate, my financial records are going public. My lawyers are currently advising full disclosure of certain past indiscretions to stop the bleeding. Your leverage vanishes the moment I decide to tell the story first. Think about it, Serafina. We can have a clean break, or we can have a long, messy war where your market value plummets right along with mine." A heavy silence stretched out between them. Eleanor held her breath, heart pounding. "You would not dare," Serafina said, though for the first time her voice wavered. "Try me," Julian bluffed, his voice remaining remarkably steady. "I have a young child to think about now. My priorities have shifted. How much is this settlement?" "Exactly," Serafina asked. "All business now." The real negotiation was officially on. It was a dark, high-stakes game played through encrypted calls and shadow lawyers who lived in the gray areas of the law, hiding the truth in plain sight. Serafina was a shark, pure and simple. She pushed for an astronomical sum and adamantly refused to hand over the souvenirs, recordings, photos, and documents detailing Julian's early crimes. Julian, heavily coached by Chloe and a grimly determined Elena, stayed firm, despite her own heartbreak. Elena's tactical mind was sharp, cutting through the emotional fog to focus on the objective. It was still a fortune, certainly enough for a lifetime of luxury, but it was far less than she had originally demanded. The entire deal hinged on two things: the return of every single incriminating file and an ironclad agreement. Their main weapon, the constant, looming threat that Julian would burn his own past to the ground just to destroy her leverage. It was mutually assured destruction during the absolute chaos. Elenina finally claimed her own future. She packed her bags and left the penthouse for a light-filled apartment on the Upper West Side that Chloe had helped her find. It felt real, it felt untainted. She hired her own team, started therapy, and found a strange, quiet peace in the persistent, fluttering kicks of her unborn son. Everything felt new again. Her anger was a dull ache by now, fueling a protective, fierce resolve that surprised even her. The entire game changed when Chloe's private investigator finally uncovered the truth. Serafina Dubois was not her real name at all. She was actually Sofia Petrova from a bleak, industrial town in Eastern Europe, and like everyone else, she had a dark past she preferred to keep buried. A past she had worked incredibly hard to bury. If this were revealed, her sophisticated, worldly mystique would shatter overnight. Moreover, they found clear evidence that Serafina was not just a mere observer of her mentor's business affairs. She was a silent partner, deeply involved in his most dangerous, illegal dealings for years. She was just as guilty as the people she blackmailed. Armed with this new, devastating information, Chloe told Julian to make one final offer. Hint that if Serafina refused, the entire truth about her past and her mentor would reach the authorities in both Monaco and France within the hour. It was finally time for her to get a taste of her own medicine. She had played the game for years, but now the rules had shifted in their favor. Serafina, ever the pragmatist, quickly realized her entire world was crumbling. She folded, just as they predicted. A secret meeting was set in Geneva to finalize the terms. Julian went with Marcus Thorne as a witness to ensure everything went according to plan. Elenina, acting on Chloe's sound advice, stayed safely back in New York, removed from the danger and the toxicity of it all. She had absolutely no wish to face the woman who had haunted her marriage for so long. Marcus later reported that Serafina was as cold and beautiful as ever, showing no cracks in her armor. She handed over an encrypted drive and an antique key to a secure safe deposit box. The transaction was swift and clinical. The expensive insurance on her hands was finally finished for good. Its value, minus the heavy penalties, was part of the final settlement. A profitable performance. "Julian," she said with a faint, ghostly smile as she signed the papers. But every show must come to an end eventually. She walked out of his life forever, still wealthy, but completely stripped of the power she had held over him. The balance of power had shifted back to where it belonged. For Julian, the relief was massive, like a heavy weight being lifted from his shoulders. But his personal life remained in absolute ruins. The divorce proceedings moved forward steadily. Elenina negotiated a fair settlement, ensuring her son's future stability, but she refused to destroy Julian completely. She wanted peace and a clean start, not a long drawn-out and bitter war. She insisted on a robust trust to protect her child's support from any future financial collapse or business failure. Months later, surrounded by the quiet comfort of her new home, Elenina finally welcomed her healthy baby boy, Ethan, into the world. He was the light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel, the symbol of a life that was finally entirely her own to command. Holding him close, she felt a sudden surge of hope. A purpose beyond Julian Vance finally existed. Ethan was her entire focus now. Julian, humbled and genuinely broken by the events, tried his absolute best to be a father to the boy. He visited often, but the air between him and Elenina was always strained, the history of their marriage acting as a wall that could never be torn down. His old swagger was dead, replaced by a quiet, somber reflection. His business empire stood, saved only by the secrets he had guarded, but he was a changed man, forever marked by the scandal that nearly ended him. He finally paid the outstanding prenatal bills with a handwritten apology that felt, for the very first time, like it was actually real and not just another calculated move. It was a small, simple gesture, but it finally closed the book on that chapter. She never saw Serafina again. Sometimes a photo would surface of her at some expensive resort, always alone, always dressed to kill. Her hands were still adorned with new, flashy rings, but they held no power over Elenina anymore. She thrived in her own way, leaving the past to those who lived in it. She returned to her art consultancy, her eye for talent just as sharp as it had ever been. She was a devoted mother, Her world circling around Ethan's every milestone and new discovery, the betrayal never fully faded. But it became a dull scar, a testament to her resilience and the fact that she had survived the absolute worst of it. She was stronger than she ever knew. She walked through fire and emerged whole on the other side. The gilded cage was nothing more than a ghost now, replaced by hard-won independence and self-respect. Her son would know a mother who was a quiet, determined victor. The story of the millionaire who insured his mistress's hands while ignoring his wife's bills became a whispered warning of greed and the strength of a woman reborn. Eleanor Vance found her own truth in the wreckage. She rebuilt her life brick by painful brick, turning the weight of betrayal into a solid foundation for a much brighter, stronger future. Julian learned the hard cost of his selfish choices, and Serafina, she walked away rich, but she lost something far more valuable in the process. Her sense of control and her dark, quiet influence. Secrets always have a heavy price, and often, the quietest person carries the hidden strength to make the powerful finally pay. What did you think of her incredible journey? Could you have been that strong under the same pressure? Tell me your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this story of justice hit home, please leave a like on the video. Share it with a friend who loves a gripping, high-stakes tale of redemption. And please, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into real-life drama. We have so many more stories to tell you. Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next one.